Hello again, and welcome back to another episode of Jefferson's Salute to the Presidents. I'm Thomas Watson, and this 8-inch tall fella is the star of the show and the most famous bobblehead in the world, Thomas Jefferson. In this episode, Jefferson and I pay tribute to the life of our 28th president, Woodrow Wilson. Did you know Wilson is the only president buried in Washington, D.C.? You'll see that and a lot more on this show. So without further delay, please sit back, grab a bowl of strawberry ice cream, a favorite of Woodrow's, and enjoy the show. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born on December 28, 1856, in this three-story brick home located in Staunton, Virginia. The home was called the Manse and was owned by the Staunton First Presbyterian Church, where Wilson's father, Joseph, served as pastor. I'm posing in the back of the manse, which looked far more impressive than the street side. Little Tommy Wilson was less than 2 years old when his father moved the family to Augusta, Georgia, where he served in the parsonage there. I tried to ring the doorbell to my right, but my hands were a bit too small. Let's go through the front door and visit the birthplace of Woodrow Wilson. This room is the first floor parlor where the Wilsons enjoyed listening to music. The guitar on the chair belonged to Jessie Wilson, Woodrow's mother. The Bible I'm standing alongside belonged to the Wilsons. Through a doorway from the parlor, I entered the dining room where I posed next to the silver tea set that was used by the Wilsons when they lived in this house. When I was carried up the stairs, the first room I visited was the pastor's study. I'm standing next to a small portrait of Thomas Jefferson. The portrait on the far wall was of George Washington. That portrait once belonged to Woodrow Wilson and hung on his wall when he was at Princeton University. Back down the stairs to the main level of the house, I was taken into this bedroom, which is the master bedroom where President Woodrow Wilson was born. While this rolling pin bed was not the one Woodrow was born in, it was from the 1930s and did belong to the Wilsons. This bed was passed down to Woodrow's older sister, Annie. The two portraits hanging above the bed were the Reverend and Mrs. Wilson. The images were not taken at the same time. Instead, the Reverend's photo was from later in life, while Jessie's image was captured not too long after Woodrow's birth. This was called a rolling pin bed because the rolling pin on top of the headboard was used to roll out a lumpy mattress. The nursery was connected to the master bedroom, and I'm standing in the original wooden crib that baby Woodrow Wilson slept in. The pine spoke-back rocker alongside the crib was used by Jessie Wilson while she fed her babies. I was shocked when museum curator Andrew Phillips insisted I stand inside the Wilson's crib for this photo. This white dress behind me was what the future president's parents forced him to wear during his infancy. On May 11th, 2022, nearly 3 years to the day after my first visit to Staunton, I returned to the Wilsons' birthplace to see it at night. Obviously, I couldn't get inside the manse, but seeing the home at night was an awesome experience. This two-story brick home was constructed in 1859 and served as the manse for the First Presbyterian Church that was located diagonally across 7th Street. In 1858, Dr. Joseph Ruggles Wilson moved his family, including the future president, from Staunton, Virginia to Augusta, where he served as minister of the church. For the first 2 years in Augusta, the Wilsons lived in a different Presbyterian manse on Green Street, but moved to the home behind me in January 1860. The Wilsons were the first occupants of this manse. Thomas Woodrow Wilson lived at this First Presbyterian Church manse for 12 years of his life. As a matter of fact, Wilson resided in this house longer than any other home during his lifetime. Let's walk through the doorway behind me and visit the boyhood home of Woodrow Wilson. The marble-top table to my left, located in the entrance hall, was original to the home when young Tommy Wilson lived here. The first floor parlor was where the future president's parents, Joseph and Jessie Wilson, entertained guests. The room featured one of the home's two fireplaces, each of which were made from slate and painted to resemble marble. I'm standing in the dining room where the Wilsons ate their meals. The second of the two full marble fireplaces was located in this room. When Governor Woodrow Wilson came to Augusta on November 19th, 1911, he was invited into the manse for Sunday dinner by the current minister of the church, the Reverend Dr. Joseph Sevier. During dinner, Wilson showed his host the scuff marks he had made as a child on that same dining room table. The silver butter dish on the dining table was engraved to Reverend Joseph Wilson and dated December 25th, 1858. This was Reverend Wilson's study, where the minister prepared his weekly sermons. During the time when Woodrow lived in the home, this room was filled with books and was said to have smelled like pipe tobacco. I was thrilled to be held so close to Reverend Joseph Wilson's desk, although I would have rather been standing on it instead. I'm standing in the best room because standing is what I do best. The best room was considered the best space in the house and was where formal guests of the Wilsons stayed. The best room also doubled as the first floor sitting room and played an informal role with neighbors and friends when they visited the Wilsons. When dignitaries and formal guests spent the night at the manse, they stayed in the bed behind me, located in the best room. Let's go up the stairs behind me and visit the family bedrooms and the upper floor sitting room. This was Woodrow Wilson's upstairs bedroom in the manse. As the only male child in the family, young Tommy had this room to himself until 1867 when his brother, Joseph Jr., was born. Later in life, Woodrow Wilson stated how much he was influenced by his time in Augusta. Not only did he adopt leadership skills by forming the Lightfoot Baseball Club, but he also witnessed the wounded soldiers who were brought to his father's church. Seeing the wounded soldiers, as well as witnessing the impact of the Civil War, played a huge role in Wilson's decision-making during World War One. During my time in the future president's bedroom, I saw a copy of the Lightfoot Baseball Club lineup Wilson had drawn up in the late 1860s. Not only was Wilson the starting second baseman, but his neighbor and best friend, Joseph Lamar, played third base. As an adult, Lamar was appointed to the United States Supreme Court by President Taft. For some strange reason, I'm always forced to pose in the bathroom at presidential homes. The first thing I noticed in Wilson's bathroom was the absence of classified documents. I'm standing in the second floor sitting room where the family gathered to relax, sew, do school lessons, read, etc. This room was also where young Tommy learned to read and was likely where he overcame his dyslexia. The future president didn't learn his letters until he was 9 years old and didn't read until he was 11. The final room I visited on the second floor was the master bedroom. Although not original to the Wilson family, the bed in the master bedroom was made by Henry Boyd in Cincinnati. Boyd was a freed slave who established a bedstead manufacturing company in Cincinnati. His beds are stamped with his name, H. Boyd, Cincinnati, Ohio. In the backyard, I saw the service building and carriage house. It was in that same carriage house where young Tommy Wilson led meetings with members of his Lightfoot Baseball Club. Those meetings became the first time Wilson, who was the president of the baseball club, showed public leadership, and that experience carried on later in life. This room, located in the service building behind the home, was the kitchen where all of the meals were prepared for the family. The first Presbyterian church in Augusta was built in 1812 and was where Joseph Wilson was pastor from 1858 until 1870. Throughout young Tommy's childhood, the future president worshiped within the walls of the historic church behind me. This two-story wood-framed home was built in 1871 for Reverend Joseph Wilson, who moved his family to Columbia from Augusta that same year when the elder Wilson became a professor at the Columbia Theological Seminary. Woodrow Wilson lived in this home from 1871 until 1874, which was when the family moved to Wilmington, North Carolina. This was the only home Joseph Wilson ever owned. During his time living in the home behind me, Woodrow Wilson enrolled at Davidson College in 1873. During his freshman year, however, Wilson left Davidson and enrolled at the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton University. As I stood in front of the home that was transformed into a museum dedicated to the Reconstruction era, I found it ironic that Woodrow Wilson always considered himself a Southerner. In fact, Wilson's father was a huge supporter of the Confederate cause, and the future president was said to have believed in white supremacy. Wilson graduated from Princeton in 1879 and soon declared his allegiance with the Democratic Party. Following his studies, Wilson was admitted to the Georgia bar and in 1882 started his own law firm in Atlanta. Woodrow didn't care for the day-to-day procedures being a lawyer required, so in 1883, Wilson enrolled at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore to study political science and history. In 1886, Woodrow Wilson lived in this house in the Bolton Hill section of Baltimore while he pursued his Ph.D. at Johns Hopkins. I'm standing outside of the door to the house where Woodrow Wilson once lived, which was connected to the home where the president of Johns Hopkins lived in the 1880s. Wilson received his Ph.D. in history and government from Johns Hopkins in 1886. To date, Woodrow Wilson is the only president to possess a Ph.D. On June 24, 1885, 28-year-old Woodrow Wilson married Ellen Axon, 25, at the home of the bride's paternal grandfather in Savannah, Georgia. The Independent Presbyterian Church of Savannah behind me was constructed in 1891 in the footprint of the original church where Reverend Isaac Stockton Keith Axon was pastor. The Presbyterian manse in the foreground was where Woodrow Wilson and Ellen Axon were married on June 24, 1885. Both the church and manse were destroyed by fire in 1889. I'm inside the Wilson-Axon room, which was a reproduction of the manse parlor where the future president was married. As I stood alone in front of the mirror, I envisioned the wedding ceremony as it played out in front of me. The bride looked stunning, while the groom looked like himself. When Woodrow and Ellen were married in 1885, they had no way of knowing what their future would bring. 28 years after they tied the knot in Savannah, Woodrow Wilson was sworn in as our 28th president. This two-story home, built in 1836 and located only a short distance from Princeton University, was purchased by Dr. Woodrow Wilson in 1889 when he was a professor at the college. After Wilson had purchased the home behind me, his wife Ellen decided she liked the design of the house across the street better. As I stood near the planter, I wondered how many times Ellen Wilson stood near the same spot, gazed across the street at their neighbor's home, and said to her husband, "Woody, you need to build me a house that looks like the one over there. I'm tired of living in this dump." In 1895, when Woodrow and Ellen Wilson left this home for the last time, they likely walked down these steps and headed for their new home just 2 doors down the street. The squeaky wheel not only gets the grease, but it also gets a new home as well. Ellen got her wish when Woodrow Wilson had this house built in 1895. The Wilsons owned and lived in this house until Woodrow was named president of Princeton University in June 1902. In my mind, there was no doubt the Wilsons' second house on Library Place looked more elaborate than the first home. While I stood near the driveway entrance, I envisioned the Wilsons' 3 daughters, Margaret, Jessie, and Eleanor, playing in that front yard. The desk where I'm standing was used by Woodrow Wilson while he was a professor at Princeton University. It was an incredible honor for me to pose on Professor Wilson's desk. The book I'm standing on, as well as the typewriter behind me, were used by Wilson at Princeton. Woodrow Wilson was named president of Princeton on June 9, 1902, serving in that role until he resigned in 1910 to enter politics. Prospect House was built in 1851 on the site of a farm whose house once hosted George Washington during and after the Revolutionary War. But that wasn't the historic home's only presidential connection. By 1878, the building and grounds were donated to Princeton University, and it became home to the university's president. As Princeton's president, Woodrow and Ellen Wilson lived in this two-story sandstone mansion from 1902 until 1910. When I stood on the windowsill of Prospect House, I envisioned Woodrow and Ellen Wilson sitting in the chairs behind me. It turned out Grover Cleveland's widow, Frances, married Thomas J. Preston in 1913 inside Prospect House as well. It was near the patio behind me where Princeton's president and his wife stood on January 1st, 1908. Woodrow and Ellen Wilson standing on their patio, January 1st, 1908. I'm standing in Ellen Wilson's flower garden near the fountain, which was added 4 decades after she lived at Prospect House. The fountain was commissioned by Princeton President Robert F. Goheen in the mid-1950s, and the statue, called Centaur, was created by artist Dimitri Hadzi. During my time in the Garden of Ellen, it was as though I could feel the Wilsons' presence there. The Wilsons as they relaxed in the Prospect House garden in 1908. Before I left Prospect House, I stood chest deep in Ellen Wilson's shrubs with the historic mansion behind me. Construction on the New Jersey State Capitol building behind me began in 1792 and was finished in 1911. In 1910, Woodrow Wilson resigned from Princeton and ran for governor of New Jersey. Wilson won by a landslide and served as governor of New Jersey from January 17, 1911 until March 1st, 1913. Due to ongoing renovations during my visit on June 12, 2023, this was as close as I could get to the exterior of the Capitol's dome. While inside the Capitol, I had the opportunity to pose in front of Governor Woodrow Wilson's portrait. Wilson had occupied that office from 1911 to 1913. New Jersey Governor Woodrow Wilson. This desk I'm standing on, which was on display at Wilson's birthplace in Staunton, was used by Woodrow during his 2-year stint as New Jersey's governor. Although Princeton is 12 miles north of Trenton, which was a good hike in 1911, Woodrow Wilson lived in this home during his term as governor of New Jersey. When Ellen and Woodrow Wilson left this house on March 1st, 1913, they headed for Washington, D.C., where the president-elect was inaugurated 3 days later. From the second-story balcony of this grand Victorian townhouse in Baltimore, 1912 presidential candidate Woodrow Wilson gave his official Democratic Party acceptance speech. During the 1912 presidential election, Democrat Woodrow Wilson went up against Republican incumbent President William Howard Taft and progressive candidate Theodore Roosevelt. Wilson won by a landslide as he finished with 435 electoral votes compared to the 88 Roosevelt had secured and the 8 votes Taft received. On March 4, 1913, Woodrow Wilson stood on the steps of the East Portico of the United States Capitol and recited the presidential oath of office. The day before his inauguration, Wilson expected crowds to meet him at the train station when he arrived in Washington. However, more people were watching the women's suffrage procession organized by Alice Paul as women's rights were gaining steam by 1913. Inauguration of Woodrow Wilson, March 4, 1913. President Wilson's first term was not without tragedy. On August 6, 1914, First Lady Ellen Wilson died in the White House at the age of 54 from Bright's disease. Ellen was the third and last First Lady to die in the White House. The first two were Letitia Tyler, John's first wife, and Caroline Harrison, Benjamin's first wife. First Lady Ellen Wilson. The Wilsons' eldest daughter, Margaret, became the White House hostess following Ellen's death. I'm standing in Independence Square, located behind Independence Hall, where President Wilson delivered a speech to a large crowd on July 4, 1914. President Wilson as he addressed the large crowd at Independence Square, July 4, 1914. During his visit to Independence Hall, President Wilson also spoke in the Assembly Room, where he sat in the chair once used by George Washington. Not only did Wilson drink ice water from a pitcher used by George Washington, he also pounded on the table in front of him to make a point. That table was none other than the table on which the Declaration of Independence was signed. Good old Woodrow didn't remain a widower for long. Roughly 7 months after his wife's death, Wilson met Edith Bowling Galt in the White House. When the president proposed marriage shortly after, the press had a field day and the rumors began to fly. Initially, President Wilson was accused of having an affair with Galt, and it got worse from there. The couple were accused of murdering Ellen Wilson. Due to the gossip, innuendos, and fake news, the couple decided to not get married in the White House. President Wilson was 58 when he married 43-year-old Edith Bowling Galt in the bride's Washington, D.C. home on December 18, 1915. First Lady Edith Wilson. The building behind me is Shadow Lawn, located on the campus of Monmouth University in West Long Branch, New Jersey. The original Shadow Lawn was built in 1903, and President Wilson used the 52-room mansion as a summer White House for 6 weeks in 1916. The original Shadow Lawn was destroyed by fire in 1927 and was rebuilt on the same site 2 years later. Even though the president never stepped foot in the building behind me, I hope the statue I'm standing on was here during Wilson's time at Shadow Lawn. President Wilson celebrated his 1916 re-election by delivering a speech from the balcony at Shadow Lawn. During the 1916 presidential election, Democrats hung their hats on the fact that Woodrow Wilson had kept the United States out of World War I. But when Americans had cast their ballots, Wilson barely won re-election when he defeated Republican candidate Charles Evans Hughes 277 to 254 in electoral votes. President Wilson's second inauguration occurred on Sunday, March 4, 1917, in the President's Room inside the United States Capitol. The following day, a public ceremony was held on the steps of the east portico of the Capitol, but the event was not without controversy. Crowds of men in Washington for the inauguration assaulted women who were picketing the White House and demanding women get their right to vote. President Wilson's public inauguration, March 5, 1917. Just 13 months after his second inauguration, President Wilson and Congress declared war on Germany. The United States had entered World War I. The United States was involved in World War I for 1 year, 7 months, and we lost over 65,000 soldiers. President Wilson became the first U.S. president to travel to Europe while in office, and he did so to help facilitate the Treaty of Versailles. In that treaty, which ended the war, Wilson also helped form the League of Nations. The telephone behind me was used by President Wilson in the White House. When President Wilson returned to New York from France after negotiating the Treaty of Versailles, this brand new 1919 Pierce Arrow limousine awaited him on the dock and took him back to Washington. President Wilson was an early enthusiast of automobiles and loved this car so much that his friends bought it for him when he left office in 1921. From July 1919 until the inauguration of Warren G. Harding in 1921, Wilson frequently rode in this limo while on official business. Even though this wasn't the limo JFK rode through Dallas in 1963, it was a presidential limousine nonetheless, and I was proud to pose in Wilson's seat. The luxurious building behind me is the Palace Hotel in downtown San Francisco. The Palace opened in 1909 and was the site of 2 speeches delivered by President Wilson over a 2-day stretch in 1919. I'm standing in the Garden Court inside the Palace Hotel where President Wilson sat on September 17, 1919. On that day, Wilson attended a luncheon and gave a speech to the Women's League in support of the Treaty of Versailles. Do you see the unique pattern on the marble column to my left? Can you see the oval indentation in the column? The President and First Lady seated in the Garden Court, September 17, 1919. A little over 2 weeks after his appearance at the Palace Hotel, President Wilson suffered a serious stroke in the White House on October 2, 1919. For months, Edith Wilson essentially ran the country while her husband recovered. In fact, some say she was the first female president of the United States. First Lady Edith Wilson helped her husband continue his presidency following his stroke. Throughout the remainder of his presidency, Woodrow Wilson's mind remained relatively sharp, but he was physically weakened and emotionally challenged. So much so, in fact, some members of Congress urged Vice President Thomas Marshall to assert his claim to the presidency, but Marshall refused. The health of outgoing President Wilson was still compromised from his 1919 stroke, and although he rode to the inauguration of Warren G. Harding with the president-elect, he did not attend the ceremony. President Wilson rode with President-elect Harding to the inauguration ceremony, March 4, 1921. Woodrow Wilson bought this house, which was built in 1915 during the last months of his second term as President of the United States. Intended as a gift to his wife Edith, the President presented her the deed in December 1920, although Woodrow had never seen the house. The former president and his wife moved into this home on Inauguration Day, March 4, 1921. Wilson made several modifications to the house, including a billiard room, stacks for his library of over 8,000 books, and a one-story brick garage. Woodrow Wilson and his Washington home. It was at this doorway where Woodrow Wilson was photographed on his 65th birthday, December 28, 1921. Woodrow Wilson on his 65th birthday. It was also from the porch to my left where Wilson addressed a crowd of military veterans on November 11, 1923. It was his last public appearance. President Wilson addressed the veterans on Armistice Day, November 11, 1923. Please follow me through the doorway where we will visit the bedroom of President Woodrow Wilson. I'm standing on Woodrow Wilson's desk in his study, which was located next to the president's bedroom. As president, Wilson had contracted influenza during the epidemic of 1918, and from then on suffered acute asthma attacks that deprived him of sleep and sapped his strength. On January 31st, 1924, Wilson experienced acute indigestion and grew steadily weaker. When his doctor arrived a short time later, he found the president near death. On February 1st, the president spoke his last words from this bed. Those words were, "I am a broken piece of machinery. When the machine is broken, I am ready." President Woodrow Wilson died in this bed at 11:15 a.m. on February 3, 1924, at the age of 67, with his wife Edith and daughter Margaret holding his hands. Construction on the Washington National Cathedral behind me began on September 29, 1907, when President Theodore Roosevelt laid the cornerstone. In 1912, Bethlehem Chapel opened for services in the unfinished cathedral, which have continued daily ever since. After a simple 15-minute funeral service was conducted at his home on February 6, 1924, the remains of Woodrow Wilson were brought to the unfinished National Cathedral for a public service in the Bethlehem Chapel. The president was originally interred in a subterranean vault beneath Bethlehem Chapel. In 1956, the centennial of his birth, Woodrow Wilson's remains were moved upstairs to the nave, where they were interred in this sarcophagus in the Wilson Bay. I'm standing on the final resting place of Woodrow Wilson, who was the only president interred in Washington, D.C. When First Lady Edith Wilson died on December 28, 1961, She was interred in a crypt below the floor next to her husband's sarcophagus. Ironically, Edith died on what would have been the president's 105th birthday. The inscription on top of the sarcophagus was difficult to read, but the Crusader's sword I'm standing on was symbolic of Wilson's valiant battle for peace following World War I. Well, that's it for another show. Did you enjoy your strawberry ice cream? Our next show will focus on the life of Warren G. Harding, our 29th president, and that'll be an episode you'll enjoy a lot. Don't want to miss it? Please subscribe to this channel and you'll get a notice when all of my episodes are published. And while you're at it, please hit that like button below and leave me a comment. If you want to see more photos and read stories about the bobbleheads' travels around the country, check out my blog at eyesofjefferson.com. Thank you so much for watching this show. TJ and I hope to see you soon. So long.